Hey, welcome everyone. Well, I'm excited. We have a great guest today on a very fascinating topic. He's written a couple of books. He's a new book. One of his newer books is called The Pocket Guide to the Polyvagal Theory, the transformative power of feeling safe. He's got a new book coming out. We're going to be talking about that as well in regards to the polyvagal theory. His name is Stephen Porges. He is the originator of Polyvagal Theory. He's a distinguished university scientist and the founding director of the Kinsey Institute Traumatic Stress Research Consortium at Indiana University. He's also a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina. So we're going to be talking a little bit about this vagus nerve. When it stays in Vegas, this time it doesn't stay in Vegas. We're going to find out more about that with Dr. Porges. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here. This is awesome stuff. I can't wait to learn more about this. So, Doctor, what got you hunting around the vagus nerve? What's going on here?
Well, it's actually more than a 50-year journey of my research. I started off in an emerging discipline called psychophysiology, and I was intrigued with heart rate patterns and what they did when people attended, when they became anxious, or when they, basically engage each other socially. And I started to notice that there were oscillations in heart rate that were dampened when people were basically thinking or attending. And I also found out that people with certain types of behavioral strategies or styles had different heart rate patterns. And then I asked the basic scientific question, what do these oscillations mean from a neurophysiological level? Because psychophysiology is really, can you measure physiology that will give you insights into psychology? It's a correlation model. And I started getting very interested in mechanism. And what I found out through my research, and this was laboratory research, was that these oscillations were driven by the vagus. And so I was actually developing methodologies to quantify the vagal influence on the heart. And that's where it all started. That was actually in the early 70s. And then I got caught into what I called the vagal paradox when I was studying newborn babies, especially heart rate patterns in preterm babies, because heart rate oscillations and this heart rate variability was protective of the newborn. They did well when they had a lot of it. And that was assumed now to be vagally regulated. But if they had massive bradycardias and apneas, meaning that the heart rate slowed and they stopped breathing, which is kind of characteristics of sudden infant death syndrome and other things, well, this is very frequent in preterm babies. They just shut down. Those bradycardias were also assumed to be vagal. So I then was caught in what I structured as the vagal paradox. And that was, how could the same nerve be involved in killing you and protecting you? And the answer to that story, and it took a while. It actually, polyvagal theory was the answer, because once I started to look at the vagus through evolution, through phylogenetic changes, how things change through evolution within vertebrae, we are a vertebrate, we see that only in mammals do we have this newer vagal regulation that produces these oscillations that are very protective. And it's, in a way, it's the mechanisms through which mammals were able to shut down their threat responses, their defenses. And so it's their journey to sociality, because mammals, unlike their asocial ancestors, the reptiles, had to turn off defenses to project safety, and so they could be in proximity with others and literally co-regulate each other's. And that's the mammalian both destiny, that we are not alone and we need to interact, starting off with the very young infant. And so this is all the product of this phylogenetic journey in which mammals get this, what I call a social vagus. And what it does is it changes social behavior from a behavior to basically a physiological system, that without social behavior, without this co-regulation through the vagus, without even the intonation of our voices. So you spend a good portion of your time listening to people and talking to them. And the intonation of a person's voice has a great effect on how you feel. You may not be aware of it, but you will be responsive to it. And if our voices have a degree of melodic prosody, prosodic alpha, those are triggers to our nervous system to be calm, because the prosodic sounds of our vocalizations are driven by our vagus nerve as well, as a parallel to what's going to our heart. And if we think creatively about evolution, how did mammals communicate with each other to know that the other was safe enough to come close to? It was the intonation of their vocalizations. So you have a rescue dog in your house. Based on how that dog is barking, you determine whether you feel comfortable in getting in proximity with it, or the dog is telling you that they're uncomfortable with that proximity. And in our voices, we do this all the time. So we will like people not based upon what they're saying. We will really feel comfortable with them based upon how they are using their voice.
That leads into about half a dozen questions I was just typing up.
I didn't mean to use the whole interview on that. So.
No, it's great. You got a great foundation for everybody now. I guess my first thought for everybody out there is, Bowlby came to mind when you were talking about it. You talked about the mother, the voice. The vagus nerve, does it develop then? The infancy stage, does it develop to a certain capacity?
First of all, let me start off by saying that's a great question. Now, I will tell you that the secrets for me became clear when I started to study preterm babies and realized that many of them come into the world so premature that they don't have this mammalian vagal circuit. So their voices have no intonation, their monotonic pitches, their mothers and their caregivers don't feel attached because the voices are not conveying love, and their faces, which are regulated in the area of the brainstem that's regulating the voice and the vagal control of the heart, are flat, so they're not giving the cues. And this develops, the vagal regulation of the heart starts to develop during the last trimester. And it requires a degree of development, not just for the social communication, but for also suck, swallowing, and breathing, coordinating that. So the nerves regulating suck, swallow, and breathing tend to be the same nerves that we use in our social behavior. And if we generalize that, we ask this question. So listen, Carlos, you and I have just met and we want to get to know each other. What do? We say, let's go out and have a cup of coffee. Let's go out and have a lunch. We're talking about ingestion, because ingestion is triggering that same circuit.
Fascinating. Yeah, that gets me another question too. You're getting me down a lot of rabbit holes here, Doctor. So now we understand it's kind of developing. Does trauma, actually it's a two-part question, and I'll let you answer however you want on which one you want to start off with, but does trauma and substance abuse play a role in preterm?
In preterm? I would rather even rephrase this. Does trauma and substance abuse affect vagal regulation? Okay, so all we need to say, especially with trauma, is when we meet people who have survived serious traumas and they've been functionally their autonomic nervous system, and that's the vagus is a major portion of our autonomic nervous system. In a sense, it's a conduit from our brainstem to our visceral organs. That brainstem regulation of that conduit changes with trauma. It basically tells the body that you're under a state of threat. And you have all these other features that come with it, like gut problems, cardiovascular issues, because our bodies are now unable to support health, growth, and restoration, which the concept is homeostatic function, where it supports itself. Instead, our nervous system is supporting defensive strategies. So the strategy in life is to really keep your autonomic nervous system out of a state of threat or out of states of defense. Now, when we talk about addiction, it means that we can't regulate our state through the normal way that we evolved to regulate it, which was through social interaction. So we're talking to each other, we're having a cup of coffee at Starbucks, I'm emoting about the crap that's gone on with me, you're listening, and then we roll reverse, and I'm listening to you and I'm nodding. And you feel, you don't need answers, you just need someone there to be supportive and allow you to emote. because that's how we really co-regulate. We don't fix problems. We are allowed to have our problems. It's a kind of a different metaphor in that. So what addiction is, we're using something else than that social interaction to regulate that physiological state. So we're using substances, or let's say addictive behaviors, exercise addiction, sexual addictions. These are, it says, massive interventions to our own body that shift state. And because we can't regulate our state through the more optimum social co-regulatory strategies.
I loved how you phrased that. That was great. I liked how you phrased that a lot. So now it brings me to another thought then. So as we move along during the years here, before we move along a little bit, do any neurotransmitters play a role at all? Or any?
Oh yeah. Okay, so let's kind of carve up the territory. Western science and Western medicine, Western physiology has emphasized subdisciplines, different components of what is really a truly interactive, unified, if we want to use the word unified, dynamic living system. So we don't have autonomic nervous system function without neurotransmitters. We don't have, so it depends on what your window is. So if your window is neurotransmitters, you see those. If your windows are neural, you'll focus on the vagus. If your window is neuropeptides, you'll focus on oxytocin. So you start seeing all these things are rotated aspects of the same process. What is it that supports our body's most optimum state of health, growth, and restoration? And what is the model that you would use? Nerves are quick, molecules are slow. Neurotransmitters actually travel through nerves quickly. So endocrine slow, but the neurotransmitters could be fast. And so we could replace vagus in our discussion by saying, what about the cholinergic system? Well, the vagus is, the acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter of the vagus.
Interesting. All right. What kind of role does it play with the vagus?
It is the neurotransmitter. It's the neurotransmitter of the motor. The outflow of the vagus is cholinergic.
Okay.
So that has a lot to do with certain things. So let's say neurochemically, you don't have the building blocks for acetylcholine. Well, you're going to probably start expressing more mobilized or anxious or less regulated behavior and physiology. So you're paying a price both on your social behavior and on the health of your organs. So I'll actually give you kind of a metaphor here. The metaphor is, are you a parent, Carlos? So Carlos, have you ever been to Chuck E. Cheese?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Lots of fun there.
There's a game there called Whack-A-Mole, which is this little mole sticks its head up and you guys keep hitting it. Well, we tend to treat disease or anything that's wrong with a person like we're playing whack-a-mole. So you have a behavioral problem, you try to work it from the behavioral. You have a neurotransmitter one, you try to feed the neurotransmitters. You have a neural one. We don't see it as an integrated system. We see it as these independent things that we could fix each one independently. You realize that that's a fallacy, because whenever you're prescribed any medicine, you read the counterindications, what can happen when you take this, because drugs do not have the specificity that we tend to want them to have. So they affect neurotransmitters.
Well, that's great. It kind of reminds me of that picture of the elephant with the individuals, they're all blindfolded. Yeah.
Yeah.
We tend to do that a lot as humans.
Yeah, are you a trunk person or it's the blind man? Whatever we do is what we do. And in science, it's really remarkable about the uneducation of the educated. I gave a talk about 2 weeks ago in a transdisciplinary conference. And then I start to say, well, what is it that I do? What is polyvagal theory? I said, really, if we take the Rubik's Cube and we start twisting it around, we start seeing multiple disciplines along the surfaces, and we're trying to look for common themes across multiple disciplines. So polyvagal theory is truly transdisciplinary, and in doing that, it also has great inference or generalization if you can extract the principles. So the principles are not bound to any one discipline, but the primary disciplines that were kind of required to even get an understanding of it was really an understanding of neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, evolution, development. And that's just to start. And you start figuring out that in retrospect, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but really it was my quest to try to find a common set of organizing principles.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Again, another barrage of questions popped up in my head, but I want to take you back for a second because I never got to ask you this question. You mentioned the vagus nerve, how it operates and how it calms at least mammalians down and after threat. Is it chicken before the egg in regards to the vagus nerve?
To the vagus. And this was when I was discussing the preterm babies and the bradycardia and the apnea. And when we get into the world of trauma, the dark side of the vagus shines its head, or its head pops out, just like the whack-a-mole. And that is, under life-threat situations, our body shuts down and it uses, again, vagal mechanisms. So it's quite within a popular culture that people will describe that they were so scared that they defecated in their clothing. That's this old reptilian vagal circuit that is shared with virtually all vertebrates as a system that, when recruited in defense, slows the organism up to basically conserve resources. But when not in defense, this old unmyelinated vagus, it's an older system that primarily regulates the organs below the diaphragm, does its job. It supports our health, growth, and restoration. But in our society, we see where a lot of people have subdiaphragmatic issues, irritable gut, irritable bowel syndrome, gastric pain, and even sexual dysfunction. And this is all due to their bodies being in this really threat state.
It kind of gets me, see if I'm right on this or not, but a lot of people eat to feel better. We know it releases dopamine and serotonin and whatnot.
So you already went into this neurochemical, complicated explanation. And I'm going to now be really aggressive because the real part you should be listening to is what is the mechanism through which you eat. And that is, you use the cranial nerves in the face and head and the mouth. And these strategies of ingestion, sucking, swallowing, and breathing, actually stimulate the vagus. They're part of the ventral vagal complex. So it's not the digestion of the food, it's the ingestion of the food. And in fact, when we're in social settings, we'll probably ingest less food to feel calm. So the eating disorder world is really about, I wouldn't say really, it's about many individuals who have eating disorders will eat alone, or that is the only option they have, and they're ingesting to regulate their state. And I'm saying that these circuits of suck, swallow, and breathe are also singing, playing wind instruments. This circuit is there. So babies, we know, and this is going back on babies, where you just give them a pacifier, they don't even have to eat to calm down, because they're utilizing the same neural circuits that trigger vagal activation that will be calming.
Fascinating. Well, Freud would have loved you.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Now, you said the complex deals with the vagus nerves and the cranial nerves. I think there's 12 cranial nerves, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Are there any other ones involved besides the three you had
Yeah,
mentioned?
well, the vagus in the brainstem, this newer mammalian vagus, actually comes from an area of the brainstem that also regulates the trigeminal, the facial, and the facial nerves. So nerves of the face, the muscles that regulate the face and head, are also influenced or interacting in the brainstem with the vagal regulation of the heart. And the vagal regulation of the heart, or I should say another vagal pathway coming from that same area, regulates the bronchi to enhance oxygenation, and regulates laryngeal and pharyngeal nerves to give us intonation of voice. So you can't think of it as separately going to the heart. You have to think in terms of a complex. And when most of the people talk about the vagus, they talk about a nerve, and they almost attribute executive functions to the nerve. And it's like saying this wire has executive functions. Well, the wire is carrying information from the brain to the organ, and the brain has the regulatory responsibility as the organ has the responsibility to respond. The cable has the responsibility to convey the information. So we want to really understand the attribution of the nerve. And so when we're really talking about the importance of the vagus, we're really focusing on the regulation of that nerve, the brainstem area.
Fascinating stuff. So everything's going to go back to that vagal regulation. As you mentioned it, anything that can damage it. I'm looking at left field here, but anything damaging to the cranial nerves that you mentioned?
See, again, I'm going to be a little bit irritable and give you a different take on that. Again, this is culturally, we tend to think of things as being broken that need to be fixed. We don't think of things as being dormant, that they're, but we haven't triggered them to be used. So we're, as a society, more comfortable with talking about neuroplasticity or retraining the system, as opposed to a system that has switches to shift state. And so we have to think of state very much like we think of water. It could be a gas like steam, it could be a fluid as we normally think of water, or it could be a solid like ice. It's still the same molecular structure. Our physiology shifts state. It turns off certain circuits and recruits others. It doesn't mean that we're damaged. So in trauma, our nervous system has been retuned to be more defensive. It's quite, let's say, would be natural that if you've been injured, you're going to be more sensitive to threat. And that's what trauma really is. It retunes the nervous system not to be trusting, but to be more aware and more sensitive to threat. Doesn't mean that the circuits that promote trusting and social interaction are gone. They're just dormant. Their priority of accessing them has been really shifted.
I guess I didn't phrase it right. I didn't mean psychological damage. I meant physical damage, physical damage to the nerve. Okay.
I think those things occur, but I think they tend to be rarer than we think. So it has to do with our attribution of where we want to have an attribution of damage to structure and not about reorganization of the neural regulation of the structure. So I would say, from my perspective, and this is what I basically call Polyvagal Theory, is an optimistic perspective. It says it's more state related than structure related, meaning the structure isn't necessarily damaged. The functions have been repurposed, reprioritized.
It's a perfect segue into polyvagal theory, at least in the therapeutic sense of it.
Yeah.
How can we use it now to help individuals?
I think the pandemic has been really an unusual open access laboratory to see what's happened. Because I actually wrote an editorial on this for a journal of psychiatry. And it's quite clear that our nervous system during the pandemic is in a paradoxical state because we're under constant threat, and we know what constant threat means. Our bodies become more defensive. But through the evolution of civilization and humanity, when we've been under threat, how do we mitigate that threat? We interact with another. We have social interactions, but during the pandemic, that has been greatly limited. And many people are literally housed now with people that are threatening to them. And it doesn't mean the notion that you're self-quarantined with a spouse or with your children isn't idyllic for many, many people. It's not the most optimal, and especially developing children. Developing children need their peers, and they need to have that co-regulation I've used it as a neural exercise. So the answer is that society is really challenging us to regulate ourselves And then once you've been greatly stressed out during this period of time, you change your vulnerability to the virus. So you change to vulnerable. We did a study looking at the mental health consequences of the pandemic, not getting the virus, but the mental health during the pandemic. And if people had trauma histories, the pandemic was more disruptive to their mental health. But that's a conditional effect. If their trauma history was there and their autonomic nervous system retuned to be more defensive, they had poor responses. If they had trauma history, but their autonomic nervous system was more resilient, they did fine. So what we could start saying is that this retuning of the autonomic nervous system, placing the individual into more of a defensive mode, is a pre-existing condition for adverse mental health consequences. And even though I don't have the data, I would imagine it also is predictive of how bad you react to the virus itself.
Fascinating. So now we threw in the immune system as well.
Absolutely. And we see the immune system is so blatant in a sense that it's a defense system. Your immune system reacts defensively. And if you're in a state of threat, the immune system becomes less differentiated. It just kind of reacts and doesn't interpret signals to turn itself off. So the immune system under constant threat is tuned differently than an immune system that is in a more homeostatic state.
So you're doing research now in the psychoneuroimmunology world as well?
Yeah, it's not my main focus, but yeah, we have collaborations going on that to try to tie this all together. But if you take the metaphor that our body goes into states of defense, you just then look for the subsystems that support defense. Immune is one of them. Don't study psychoneuroimmunology independent of autonomic regulation. It's part of the same system. It's just looking at, so the same brainstem areas become involved in both. You're just looking at different output measures.
I talked to Dr. Vishton a while back ago. We were talking about child development and social media. This is kind of like an opinion question, I think. I'll throw it at you, just kind of curiosity here in our last few minutes. One of the things that came to mind when you said, right now with COVID, we don't have the ability to meet with people for lunch, for instance. Like you and I, we can't get together for lunch or anything of that nature, but we can connect via Zoom.
Yeah.
But he mentioned there was this different type of stimulation, a different type of activity in the brain when you do that. What do you think about that?
Well, in the editorial I wrote, I talked about video conferencing as the best thing we have. It's not perfect, but it also meant that we have to relearn how we use two-dimensional screens as a social interactive portal, because we are so conditioned as a cultural species that two-dimensional screens are for two things: entertainment and education, and in both of them we're not really involved. We multitask. We don't, in a sense, engage. So what I started doing, and this is my own personal bit, is that I knew during the pandemic that my nervous system needs interaction. So the first thing I started doing was wearing my reading glasses. So I can now see people's faces better. And the part is, you look at the upper part of people's faces because that's where you get the cues of engagement. So by doing that, I started getting I would say social benefits, which meant, for, in my perspective, neurophysiological benefits of co-regulation through the internet, through doing this. I also realized I got injured during the pandemic. I twisted my back and was in excruciating pain. But I have a schedule like you have a schedule where you have to talk and give workshops. And whenever I was online, I had no pain. So the social engagement system basically downregulate my defenses. So if we see chronic pain as really being our bodies in a state of defense, it was incompatible if I was socially engaged. Now, it didn't cure the pain. The pain had its own time course, but I was sitting in front of monitors for hours and without pain. And it was an interesting self-learning experiment, because the theory says that should work. I didn't expect actually, I didn't really understand that part of my theory until I realized that pain is part of our defensive system. And mammals evolved with a process that called neuroception. Neuroception is how we detect risk in the environment. So it could be risks or threats, or it could be cues of safety. And what makes us as a species unique, or let's say mammals as unique species, is that our neuroception is also a neuroception of safety, which means we can reflexively, adaptively, and dynamically turn off our defenses through cues of safety, which are interacting.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating. Wow.
So now you see that the principles underneath therapeutic models is to get the body into a safe state, so that these systems downregulate our defenses and then get the body used to being safe. And that's what therapy should all be about.
So I guess one of my last questions, there's not really the way to measure vagal regulation, if it's being effective, is going to be physiological, psychological, all the above?
Well, first of all, it can be measured physiologically. You have to think in terms of neural platforms. So you have a physiological platform upon which psychological experiences emerge. So you're not going to have a one-to-one physiological, mental lining up, but you'll have certain physiological states promote sociality, they'll promote creativity, basically they promote safety. And what is safety? It enables us to be intellectually bold, to be creative. If we are fearful, are we social? No. Are we creative? No. Are we bold? No. So we're basically like this on all levels, and that can also be within academics. So in my transdisciplinary talk, I said to be transdisciplinary, to be accepting of other disciplines, you had to be intellectually safe. You had to, in a sense, be accessible intellectually, which means you have to be physiologically safe. So there are these underlying platforms, and the vagal regulation can be measured. That's not a great challenge. And that can be monitored, dynamically. And what we can see is that people who have more, let's say, vagal regulation of the heart, which is an easy marker to get, they tend to be much more resilient people. And that's not a permanent trait necessarily. This is the part that I really want to say, is that we can exercise these circuits, we can optimize whatever we were gifted with. So if there are going to be individual differences, but we have to take a very positive narrative of our human experience. And that is, we can optimize what we have, and that will reduce many of the symptoms that really override our current contemporary world, which will be anxiety, which is really the body's in a state of threat, which will be, in a sense, we're watching this in politics. You don't basically convince people with data what's right or wrong. They're threatened by whatever's going on. And that shows you dynamically in real time the accessibility of another person's intelligence to process information. If your world is constantly ramping up threat, you're not going to be accessible to alternative perspectives. And alternative perspectives, especially, I think this is probably what you enjoy with your podcast, is that alternative perspectives trigger curiosity, and they are what makes us get up in the morning. We want to learn more.
Absolutely. Great conversation. I can have you here all day, but I know you got to go to work. I got to go to work.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff indeed. When's your new book coming out?
It should be out by the summer. It's called Polyvagal Safety, and it's really the theme. And there's an interesting part that I wrote for it, which is really about our phylogenetic journey to sociality. And once we start to understand that that's really been, that journey is really a quest for safety in the arms of others, as people that we feel safe with. And so that part of our heritage, or our biological imperative, which means what our species needs to survive, is to connect with other people. And what you're doing with these podcasts are providing platforms for people to connect.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Thank you again for your work. Great work. Great work. Polyvagal Theory, the book, you can get it on Amazon.com. I highly recommend it. They have two versions, the Pocket Guide to the Polyvagal Theory. Stephen Porges, Proges, is the name of the author, the one we just spoke to right now. The Polyvagal Theory, Neurophysiological Foundations of Emotions, Attachment. I got to get the whole book title here. It's a little long. Here it is. Communication and Self-Regulation. You can get it on Amazon.com. I highly recommend it. A fascinating new world that we're exploring right now and finding so much great information. Thank you so much, Dr. Porges, for being here.
You're quite welcome. I enjoyed the session, the interaction, and wishing you the rest of a good day for the rest of the day.
You too, sir. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Make sure to share and subscribe if you want to support our podcast.